When working with data sets, sometimes we want to ask questions like, what happens most often? Or what was the largest response? What was the smallest response? And if we have our data listed like we do on the screen, it might be a little difficult, or at least annoying, to try and pick out those interesting facts about our data set. It's a lot easier if we organize our data into, say, a frequency table. So let's do an example of a frequency table. Here we have a data set that represents 20 students and how many hours they work per day. I want to organize that data into the table that we have on the screen. I have two columns. One column is called data value, and that's where I'm going to list the different types of data values that live in my data set. So we have 2s and 3s and 4s, 5s, 6s, and 7s. There's no 1s, so I will not put a 1 in my data value column because that doesn't exist in my data set. There's no fractions, there's no numbers bigger than 7, so again, I won't list those numbers. It's not like a number line, it's just the types of numbers that live in my data set. Next, I need to count the number of times each data value occurs. So the data value 2 occurs multiple times in my set. I have 1, 2, 3 2s. So my frequency for the data value 2 is 3. Notice that I've crossed those 2s off in my list. That's going to help me make sure that I don't double count or undercount any data values. And when I put the 3 in the frequency column, this is a way for me to say 3 students told me that they work 2 hours per day. So the frequency tells me how many times that answer came up in the survey. Let's go ahead and fill out the rest of the frequency column. I'll count my numbers of 3s. I have 5 3s, so 5 students told me they work 3 hours a day. Counting my 4s. 3 students said they work 4 hours a day. 6 students told me they work 5 hours a day. 2 students work 6 hours a day, and 1 student works 7 hours a day. That is a frequency table. Simple as that. List out the types of data values that you have, and then how many times each of those data values occur. Now that we have our data organized in this frequency table, we can see, for example, the most common response to our survey question. The data value 5 appeared 6 times in our list. That tells us that 6 students told us that they work 5 hours a day, and that's the most frequent of an answer that we have from our survey. Notice that in the frequency column, 6 is the largest number, so that's the highest frequency. So 5 hours is the most common response. Largest frequency, most common response. We might also be interested in relative frequencies. That's going to give us a ratio of frequencies to the total number of outcomes. Now we know that there were 20 students surveyed, so we should have 20 different data values in our frequency table. Let's check to make sure that we have all of them there. We'll add all of the values in our frequency column, so we'll add 3, 5, 3, 6, 2, and 1. We'll check that our total here matches the number of surveyed students. If we had a 19 in our frequency column, that would mean that we missed a number in our data set, or if we had 21, that would mean we double counted something. So it's important to check that our frequency column does sum to the total that matches how many surveys we sent out. Moving on to make our relative frequency column, I'm going to take the frequency for each data value and write that as a fraction over my total. So for the data value 2, I have a frequency of 3, and that is going to be on top of our total 20. And we're going to make our relative frequencies the same way, just moving down each row. So for the data value 3, I have a frequency of 5 over the total outcomes of 20. For the data value 4, a frequency of 3 over my 20 outcomes. For the data value 5, we had a frequency of 6 over 20 outcomes. data value 6, we had a frequency of 2, and for the data value 7, we had a frequency of 1. Our relative frequency, notice that it just has all of the frequency numbers as numerators over fractions, where the denominator is always the total number from your data set. So it's always 20 in that column. Now, just like our frequency column, we can add all of the values in our relative frequency and make sure that it sums to equal 1. Now, adding these fractions, we'd get 20 over 20, but we know that that's equal to 1. Now, if we didn't get 20 over 20 in this column, that's a signal that we made a mistake and we need to go back and look for the error. So that's again a way to check that we're doing this correctly. Next, we can talk about cumulative relative frequency. Now, cumulative relative frequency, that's going to take our relative frequency column and count the accumulation as we move down the table. So we'll make an additional column. We'll call it cumulative relative frequency, and we're just going to list out the sums of the relative frequencies as we move down the list. Now, for data value 2, there's nothing to combine that relative frequency with, so we copy that one over. That one gets copied straight over. And as we move down, we're just going to pick up an additional relative frequency. So I'll take my 3 over 20 and add it to the next relative frequency, which is 5 over 20. So we'll do 3 over 20 plus 5 over 20. That will give us 8 over 20. That's the cumulative relative frequency for the data value 3. And then we'll move down the list, adding as we go. So 8 over 20 plus 3 over 20. On, keeping on. So 11 over 20 plus 6 over 20. 17 over 20, 17 over 20 plus 2 over 20, 19 over 20, and then lastly 19 over 20 plus 1 over 20 is 20 over 20. Now, frequency and relative frequency, they each had a self-check that's built in. Right? And frequency we add to make sure that our total matches the true total of our data set. Same with relative frequency, we add to make sure that the total is equal to 1. For cumulative relative frequency, we've already done adding as we moved down the rows. So to check that we did our cumulative relative frequency correctly, we're going to make sure that the very last row has an entry that's equal to 1. Now, there's one other version of this table that you'll see, and that's where we eliminate the word relative in that last column. If I were to leave out the word relative and just call this cumulative frequency, then I'm ignoring relative frequency altogether, and I'm just looking at my frequency column, and I'm adding those values up as we move down the list.